Okay, thank you, Jan. Our next speaker is the author of Thinking Out Cloud, a book called Thinking Out Cloud, and he also has a blog under that same name. He's been described as one of the top 12 thinkers in cloud computing, so it's a real honor for us to have him here presenting at Cloud Connect. He's here to tell you that, surprise, your enterprise is already using the public cloud. So please join me in welcoming Geva Perry.
Thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. Let me see, do I click this to get this started? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the sort of the pattern of cloud computing adoption, which has gotten some attention, but not enough, in my opinion. Should get more. And so I want to describe it a little bit and talk about some of the implication it has to a couple of constituencies in the industry. Really briefly about me, so as was said, I write the blog Thinking Out Cloud. Please check it out. I've been writing about cloud computing for about 5 years now, one of the early bloggers on it, I guess. And so it's relevant to the presentation that sort of followed some of these patterns that are happening for a while now. You can also follow me at Twitter at Geva Perry. And my day job is I work with a bunch of companies, startups and big companies. I'm on the board of 3 companies, the advisory board of a few companies, and advisor to a bunch of others, helping particularly on strategy and marketing for cloud computing, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, companies who are struggling with some new business models, which I'll actually talk about that in the presentation. So I have a pet peeve, and my pet peeve is with cloud computing adoption surveys. I'm sure you've all seen these. You know, the analyst firms, the magazines, other research companies, even vendors like IBM and so on, going out and asking folks, have you adopted cloud computing, or what are your plans on adopting cloud computing, and different questions like that. And my problem is that these surveys are usually very, very misleading, because in the tradition of this industry, they go top down. They go to the last person I would ask about cloud computing adoption, and that's the CIO. So they go and they ask CIOs and senior IT exec, is your organization already using cloud computing and so on, and many times they get negative responses or very timid responses. So this creates a phenomenon such as this. These are 2 headlines from CIO magazine. Both of them relate to CIO surveys about cloud computing adoption. And as you can see, the one from 2009, survey casts doubt on cloud adoption. Only 15% say they have anything to do with cloud computing. And a couple of years, the hype was right on cloud computing. Turns out they didn't really know, the CIOs, that their organizations were already using cloud computing in various forms. And the reason this is happening is because the way adoption of cloud computing has worked so far, and is primarily still the case, even though it's slightly changing now, is that the adoption is happening bottom up. So in particular, so it's happening through the rank and file, and then starting to move up the organization. I call it organizational creep up. In particular, if we look at sort of what really started this wave of cloud computing, you can think of Amazon. It was really a developer-driven adoption. It certainly wasn't a CIO top-down strategic decision. It certainly wasn't an IT executive initiative. None of those things. It wasn't even IT ops that really drove the adoption of Amazon. It was developers. And Amazon understood this very well and built their product, Amazon Web Services, in a way that was very, very friendly to developers in a number of ways. The way the APIs are, just the whole experience you get through was clearly developer-oriented, and that strategy succeeded very well. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to run my own survey with the InfoQ guys. They asked me to design a survey, and I actually tested this hypothesis. Now, I admit that it wasn't a perfect, from a methodological point of view, it wasn't a perfectly done survey, because I still don't know who it is exactly that I'm asking. But it's the first survey that I saw, the one that I wrote, that I asked, who in your organization first made the decision to use any cloud computing service? The question was worded slightly different in the actual survey, but that's the gist of it. And as you can see, this sort of gives some evidence to my hypothesis about this, but of course there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I talked to a lot of people from all directions, the vendors themselves, the customers, and pretty much everybody agrees that this is the phenomenon that's happening. So this is also true, by the way. So I gave Amazon, and I'm talking about cloud computing, a particular, sort of a infrastructure as a service bent. But really, it also applies to software as a service. And we've seen the same thing, just to take another major, obvious example, like Salesforce.com. Again, a lot of that was driven, organizations at that point, they were using these top-down systems like Siebel, CRM software that was implemented throughout the organization, cost, $15 million, took 2 years to implement, all that good stuff. And a lot of the teams were unhappy with those systems and weren't really using them, and they started buying Salesforce.com accounts. I remember, I think the first time I read about this, that some wealth management group of 50 people, and this was 2 years after Merrill Lynch bought a $20 million license agreement from Siebel. They decided they're not using Siebel, but they're going to use Salesforce, and they bought it with their own credit cards. This is an actual quote from Mark Benioff's book about this, where this was their first enterprise deal. He's talking about SunGuard here, and his VP sales will tell him, that the sales guys are essentially just buying it on their own. They're not really competing with other vendors. Now, this pattern isn't new. We've seen it before, in particular with open source software. There's a great blog that I highly recommend reading that describes this phenomenon with open source software by Stephen O'Grady at Red Monk, called Meet the New Kingmakers, same as the old Kingmakers. And the Kingmakers he's referring to are developers. And he's basically saying, they're the ones who are really making the decision, whether the enterprise knows this or not, of adopting new software products. And his claim is also that it's, happened before. It's not the first time. This is how PCs were first adopted in the enterprise. This is how Windows first made its way in the enterprise. Maybe Unix, maybe other sort of technological innovations that were adopted bottom up as opposed to top down. There's also a couple of other anecdotal stories that are very, very powerful out there on the web. There's Billy Marshall, who writes on open source, but cloud also has a great blog called the CIO blog post called "The CIO is the Last to Know," where he's talking about one of the examples he's giving is he's doing a tour with a data center with a large company, a large financial services company, and he's walking down with the CIO, and the CIO tells him Billy used to work at Red Hat, tells him we don't use Linux. We only use, we don't use open source software. We don't use Linux. And as they tour the data center, the CIO finds out right next to him that 25% of their hundreds of the machines are actually running Linux without the CIO knowing it. Jonathan Schwartz, who's the CEO of Sun Microsystems, rest in peace, who, not him, the company, who also has a great anecdotal story on his blog post, which since then Oracle has taken off, not surprisingly, about going to a CIO of a Fortune 500 company and telling him, I want to do a deal with you about MySQL. This was, of course, after their acquisition of MySQL, for buying licenses, services, et cetera. And the guy says, well, I banned MySQL in this organization. We only use Oracle. And then, Jonathan Schwartz pulls out, yeah, we've seen your people download MySQL thousands of times. They must be using it somewhere. Then, the guy goes, checks, and he has dozens of apps running on MySQL. So this same phenomenon that we saw with open source, we're seeing with cloud computing, I think even stronger. And my question is, why? And I won't go into too deep of an analysis of this, but I think there's two things to think about here. One, people have the motivation to do this now. So I'm sure you've all heard about these phenomena that have been called in different names: the consumerization of IT, the democratization of IT. The idea that, a lot of it is driving for, we all use iPhones. We're all using all these web services, Gmail, Google Docs, all these wonderful apps that we as consumers have access to. And we're saying, why is the software we're using in enterprise, why does that suck so much as opposed to these, wonderful tools that we're using at home? And we're expecting that at work, and so that sort of motivates us to go seek those tools. The other thing is something that Sarah Lacy and others call the millennial entitlement, the millennial generation. Kids born from 1980s. I say kids. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience here are those people. I'm a little older than that. So it's kind of people born from 1980 to maybe even all the way up to 2000 who, again, are sort of have this expectation that all this stuff should just work, this technological stuff, it should be connected, it should be accessible everywhere, all this stuff. I can see that with my kids. You know, they just expect this stuff. You know, Google Docs is a given for them, that they have access to it from any computer in the house, to their documents and stuff like that. So this sort of millennial entitlement phenomenon, I think, is also driving this. But it's not enough to be motivated. You have to have the opportunity to actually do it. And so I think, obviously, with the cloud, it's so easy to adopt this stuff. It's on demand. It's there. It's very low upfront cost, so you could just pull out a credit card and start using it and all that good stuff. So all of that is happening. Makes it very easy for folks to adopt it. Now, real quickly, because I'm running out of time, is what it means to use. Obviously, for enterprises, my message is, don't fight it. Find ways to make it work for your people. Find ways to be able to sort of balance the choice for your employees and the control. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, but we don't have a lot of time. And from the vendor perspective, I mean, just find the way, understand that this phenomenon is happening, and build and design your products in a way that encourages this, works with this, helps it. For example, you know, building no-touch or low-touch sales model, making it so that it can be viral within the enterprise. So if someone in the rank and file starts adopting it, make it easy for them to send reports out to their bosses or invite other users and so on, so it can kind of in a viral fashion be adopted within the enterprise. Those are the main points. That's it for me. Thank you very much. I'm also talking on Thursday at 9 a.m. I'm giving a talk about the application stack, so come see that too, please. Thank you.